My name's Peter McColl. I'm a long-time Portobello resident, and I've been involved in attending events at the book festival for a number of years. I'm really pleased to have been asked to host this chat with another Peter, Peter Geoghegan. And Peter Geoghegan is a long-time friend of mine. We were at university together because Scotland's that small and Edinburgh's that small. And has recently had a bestseller book, Democracy for Sale. Peter is the editor-in-chief of the Open Democracy website and has been, previously to that, the investigations editor. So, Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write the book?
Yes, Peter. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Unfortunately, I can't be in Portobello. I would absolutely love to be in Portobello. But since the kind invitation was extended for me to attend the book festival, I've had to go down to take over this new job as editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. Has seen me in London. So I'm speaking to you from a sunny London rather than by the sea in Portobello, which frankly, I'd rather be by the sea in Portobello, perhaps having a beer in the Esplanade. But needs must, so I'm here. And well, just to give you a bit of background, this is not a book I thought I'd write. I didn't think I was going to end up writing a book about, dark money and dirty politics in Britain. It's not something I was going to be doing. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said, "Oh, why would I do that?" But it kind of emerges. It kind of emerges almost organically. I'm a reporter. I'm a long journalist for many years, and the book actually dates back now over 5 years ago to June. It was June exactly, June the 21st. 2016. And for those who might remember, that was 2 days before the Brexit referendum. And I was doing that thing. I was a journalist at the time. I was stringing, means I was kind of a freelance reporter for the Irish Times. And my news editor sent me down to Sunderland in the northeast of England to do that thing that reporters do before a big news event, to go and kind of take the temperature of what's happening in a place. So I went down to Sunderland. And when I was in Sunderland, talked to loads of people, many of them told me they're going to vote to leave the European Union. They talked about Facebook. They talked about all sorts of other stuff. I was like, this is really interesting. As I was leaving the station, I picked up a copy of the Metro, the free newspaper, and it had a big wraparound advert on it. And it said, "Vote Leave, take back control." And on the back of the advert, on the back of the wraparound, there was a logo, the logo of a political party I knew very well, the Democratic Unionist Party. And it said, a little blurb that says, "Paid for by the DUP." And I was like, that's really odd. Why are the DUP, I used to work in Belfast. I know the DUP don't spend money if they can avoid it. Why are the DUP taking ads out in Sunderland? Are they going to run for seats in Sunderland? So that's very odd. So I took a picture of it, sent it on Twitter, the other thing journalists do these days. And frankly, I got on that train and started typing my copy for the next day's paper because of deadlines. And a few months later, Adam Ramsey, who's then and still is at Open Democracy, he got in touch with me and said, "I hear you're interested in the DUP and their Brexit campaigning," because he'd been looking at it too. He'd been in Edinburgh and he'd noticed loads of posters and placards that said the same thing, paid for by the DUP. And he was wondering what this was about too. So the two of us got together and we started doing a bit of digging. We did a bit of investigation and we found that the DUP had spent £435,000 in their Brexit campaign. What was most interesting about this was it was almost all in England and in Scotland and in Wales, but not in Northern Ireland. And the source of the money was completely anonymous because of a loophole in Northern Irish electoral law that allowed you to accept money without having to say where it came from. You didn't have to publish the names of the donors like you do in the rest of the UK. And so that basically, that story, I couldn't believe it. We started writing, we wrote many stories about it. Eventually they changed the law in Northern Ireland, so now you have to declare their donors. But it kind of gave me a little bit of an eye into how does money work in British politics? How is influence bought and sold? Like, if it's possible to spend almost £500,000 in a really important referendum without anyone knowing where the money's come from, what else is going on? So that kind of led me down this rabbit hole, and the book kind of came out the other side of it. I went from the DUP into looking at all sorts of other things, the way money works in politics, the way social media has changed politics, the way influence is bought and sold in Westminster. So it kind of started off from a small acorn, or a copy of the Metro on Sunderland, a Sunderland train station platform, to just, getting lost in this world for many years, and this book is a product of it.
Thanks. I mean, I remember a conversation with Adam Ramsey, who's also a friend of mine and also a Portobello resident, of course, who had picked up exactly the same advert on the Metro as well at Waverley Steps, and was asking me why the imprint on it, which is what you call that logo, was from the DUP. I think one of the really interesting things about this is that there was a study a number of years ago that suggested that it's interesting that people spend so little money on politics in Britain compared to other countries, and compared to the level of influence that it effectively buys you. And I think what the book really effectively does is dissect who's making that influence and how they're using it. Do you want to talk a little bit about who the big funders are, where we know who they are, and how they're using that influence?
This is one of the interesting things. So when I started, I did that big DUP story, and it went really big, and I ended up, I was a freelance journalist, ended up coming to work for Open Democracy, running our kind of dark money investigations into like money in British politics. But frankly, when I'd done that DUP story, and when I started looking at British politics, I was like, yeah, like money in politics is interesting in Britain, but it's not that big a deal because there's not that much money compared to America. Like in America, billions were spent on the 2020 presidential election. Even like a down ticket Senate race in a state can cost millions just to get anywhere on it. And in Britain, you're talking about hundreds of thousands at some stages. The last general election was the biggest spending general election in history, and it was less than 100 million was spent, which is a lot, but compared to America, it's not that much. And I was like, it can't make that much of a difference. Like in Britain, whereas in America, you have to give millions and millions to get near a politician. In Britain, if you give £50,000 a year to the Conservative Party, you become a member of a thing called the Leaders Group, and every quarter you get to go to a meeting with the Prime Minister and leading cabinet ministers to have an off-the-record, completely clandestine chat about whatever interests you. No notes are kept, no minutes are kept, no one even knows who's there. So it's like, I can't, £50,000, maybe British politics, maybe it doesn't matter that much, but it's exactly that. That's why the small amounts of money really do matter. We don't have a history, real culture, politically giving, which is actually much bigger in America. So most people don't. Like the vast majority of people do not give money to political parties. So it means the people that do are actually really important because unlike in Europe, our political parties run on private money. So they need to raise money to survive. So what that means is if you're willing to put your hand in your pocket, like one of those Tory donors, you can get a lot of access for not a lot of money. And actually, as we're seeing, it's funny, the book came out last August. And if anything, so much stuff has happened since then that really, I think, has confirmed a lot of the thesis in the book. We saw the Greensill scandal with David Cameron. We saw kind of, almost the Sunday Times almost had a weekly cash for access story. So we've actually seen just how much is possible to buy your way into political office. We had the incredible sight of Peter Cruddas, who is now Lord Cruddas, who's basically he long-standing Tory donor, former Tory treasurer. The day after he gave £500,000 to the Tories, he was ennobled. So you can it's not hard to see the direction of travel this goes in. So I found it really interesting. As I said, when I started, I was like, it can't matter because there's not that much money, but actually because there's so little money floating around this little closed loop, getting access to it matters even more, and people will do more to get access to it. So politicians will go further than they might in another place where the money wasn't as important.
And I mean, I think there are two interesting things about that. One is the influence that it buys, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But the other is, I think the ban on broadcast advertising in the UK meant that money was late coming into British politics. There wasn't much advertising to buy. You could buy it in the papers, but that actually makes relatively little difference. It's the broadcast advertising that costs enormous amounts of money in the United States, and because that wasn't available to British parties, so they weren't fundraising in the same way. What I think has changed, and you talk about this a lot in the book, is social media and the opportunities to advertise through social media, and particularly the vote leave or the vote to leave the EU, which was really driven through social media. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of the big things. I think you're right. So, it's been a long-standing bet noir on the kind of conservative right in Britain that we have basically, we have a broadcast ban effectively buying television ads, and we have kind of a lot of impartiality rules about advertising that goes on television. And there's long been a push to get rid of it, or there was until a few years ago when a lot of people, especially on the political right, discovered that social media could do that job instead. And there's frankly no regulation whatsoever really when it comes to social media. And there certainly wasn't 5 years ago. So what you saw, the Leave campaign was really interesting and really clever. And what it was doing it in plain sight, but we only found out after the fact. They spent really, really, really heavily on social media adverts. They spent millions and millions of pounds. Dominic Cummings' big thing was to spend lots of money on social media adverts. And they did a lot of it in the last 72 hours of the campaign. So a lot of it only came out months, if not years down the line. So we weren't able to see what had happened. So two things were happening there. One was that social media allowed, especially the Leave campaign, to push much harsher messages than they would have done in public. And this is the case in general with social media. Both target advertising happens too, that's part of it. But I think another really important part is just changing the discourse or changing the conversation online in a way that wouldn't happen with an advert on the side of the bus. So if you looked at like the kind of language that the Leave campaign was using publicly, they weren't really talking about immigration all that much. That was mainly Leave.eu and Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks. But on social media, they were pushing adverts about Syria, pushing adverts about Turkey. They kept on talking about Turkey. Turkey joined the European Union, which wasn't something that was going to happen, and everybody really knew it. But social media allowed you to push those ads without really anyone noticing. If you bought that ad and put it on the side of a bus, there would have been loads of coverage. There would have been basically a blowback against it. You would have had press coverage. But on social media, you could do all this stuff, and no one really knew about it. The other thing that social media was possible to do, it made it, in some ways, it makes it a lot easier to spend money in politics. And what the Leave campaign was, they actually broke the law by overspending. But historically, actually, loads of money can only ever get you so far in politics, because even if you have loads of money, you need activists, you need people to go out in the doors, you need people to do stuff for you with this money. Social media kind of takes out the middleman. You can run campaigns online, you can run campaigns, especially in 2016 on Facebook, without anyone seeing them, but which can be really effective. And I was really struck, as I say, when I started at the start of this conversation, I was talking about when I was in Sunderland. Yeah, I saw that advert for the DUP, but I also was talking to people who were saying, oh, Turkey's joined the EU, that's why I'm voting to leave. And I was like, where did you see that? Well, I saw it on Facebook. And you're like, okay, that's really interesting. So these conversations are clearly permeating through Facebook and allowing things to happen that you wouldn't see in regular campaigning. And we're so behind the curve on this. Like our laws, until about 20 years ago, we almost had no laws on kind of political donations and publishing political donations. Only companies really had to, and they would publish them in their annual accounts. But we now have laws on that. But our laws really, even though they're only 20 years old, were written for the analog age. We are now doing digital politics. And until really recently, if you got, and I think it's now gone, I think it's now finally been passed, but there was no imprints for digital ads. So during the Leave campaign and subsequent general elections, you didn't have to say who was paying for an advert. You didn't say what political party was behind it. You still don't have to say exactly who's paid for it. What was the political party who was paying for it? You didn't have to do that. So if you think about it, at election time, you might get a leaflet under your door with a picture of somebody saying, vote for me. And it'll always have to have a little imprint that says who's paid for it and on whose behalf. That doesn't happen with social media. It didn't until very recently. So even little things like that. But beyond that as well, we saw at the last general election, I did a lot of what we call kind of third-party campaigners or non-party campaigners, which are ginger groups that can pop up on social media, buying huge amounts of adverts, declaring no donations. I did a story, I found that almost £1 million have been spent on mainly anti-Labour ads by these groups that just appeared out of nowhere, claimed that they raised loads of money without ever having to prove it, because frankly, the Electoral Commission never goes and finds out if you can prove that where the money came from, and then disappeared the next day. And we're seeing that more and more. And I think that's one of the things that's so the broadcast ban no longer really matters just because of that. It doesn't, it's been rendered obsolete by the reality that social media is where it's happening.
And I mean, I think part of what seems to have happened here is the electorate's almost been ambushed by these developments. So the electorate are still reacting as if it was an analog age. You get really high quality stuff on Facebook, and I think people sometimes find it very difficult to disaggregate the quality of the production from whether or not it's true. So you were used to seeing things that were really high quality on the TV, and if they were really high quality, you could trust them. Now you can produce something really high quality, put it in the internet, and people will believe it because it's the same quality as they used to see on TV, but it has almost none of the regulatory governance that those TV productions used to have, and so people will believe that. And I mean, we see it also with COVID conspiracies and other things like that, where people have become very credulous around these sorts of things online. Do you think that's a big part of what's happened here, the electorate being caught unawares?
I think there's something to do with that too. I think we are seeing and at the same time, I guess what I say in my book is I'm not saying that the kind of worlds that kind of changed political campaigning are the only reason we're seeing strange things happening in our politics. I think it's both a symptom and a cause, but lots of other things are happening too. And I think that what's interesting is there's almost things happening simultaneously, like the breakdown in traditional party political allegiance is real too. So you're seeing a lot more floating voters. You're seeing more voters, who are not like completely, like they're not as secure, like they're not as kind of wedded in some respects, and for good and for bad, what that means in terms of traditional kind of voting patterns. So there's more people floating around, more people, I think, engaging with political content. And I think in some ways that's an opportunity. It's good that people aren't just going and turning up and voting to Conservative or Labour as a force of habit without thinking anything else. But I think that's, at the same time as well, like we have an electorate that's probably not as sophisticated at times in understanding and parsing how some of this messaging is happening. And I think that's given huge opportunities for, kind of like it's the classic journalism phrase that the lie has gone around the world before the truth has put its boots on. And there's definitely something happening with that. By the time we saw it during the general election, so what you saw during the UK general election, I think I'm really fascinated with the 2019 general election. Which was like, it felt like watching, because I was writing my book and reporting on the UK general election. I was finishing the book. The book was due out actually early 2020, but the pandemic put it back. And I was watching in real time exactly what I was writing about. So I was writing a book and reporting simultaneously. And the reporting and the book were kind of melding into one. Because what was happening was, the worst of what I was suggesting could happen was happening in front of us. If you remember, the Conservatives hired a political consultancy called Topham Guerin, two young guys from New Zealand, famous for making like really hard-nosed social media memes, to run their social media campaign. On a live discussion, during a live leaders debate, they rebranded their Twitter account as a fact-checking account. And not only did they do this, they then doubled down on it. You had, I think it was Michael Gove and Dominic Raab both saying this was a totally fine thing to do. In the same company, Topham Guerin, on behalf of the Conservatives, bought adverts on Google with a fake Labour manifesto. So if you typed in Labour manifesto, that's what happened. You got at the top of your list was a fake manifesto putting the boot into Labour. Like this and these are the kind of things that just never happened before in British politics in terms of campaigning. Like that's especially because it happened in social media, it almost became seen as something that's not happened. It became something that like kind of it happened in another world. And I think politicians have been quicker at like kind of understanding that there is no IRL, non-IRL split really for people anymore. But we still think and talk in those terms. And voters actually don't voters talk and think in those terms too, but they really don't. They live in the world that we're all living in now, in which real life and the internet are the same. They're completely and utterly commingled. And I think there's almost a first adopter opportunity with that too, I think, as well. I think there's been people who've moved really quickly into that space and pushed it really, really far. And I think, I would worry about what another general election would look like based on the last one and the way we've seen social media becoming a space in which kind of anything goes, because there's no comeback. That's the other thing. You and I will sit here and go, that is a terribly bad thing to do, like to rebrand, pretend to be a fact-checking account, especially in this day and age of like disinformation. But there was no comeback, there was no electoral price paid for that. So you're looking at political parties, they're almost certainly going to go, well, didn't hurt us, let's do it again.
There's a really interesting thing about that. I was totally bemused that the Conservative HQ Twitter account had rebranded itself as a fact-checking account and then didn't really do fact-checking but made partisan points. And I mean, one of the interesting things is that, partly because the mainstream actors in the EU referendum were almost all on the Remain side, this was the first time that a main player in British politics had used those sorts of tactics. And I thought it might well backfire on them. But interestingly, it didn't. And I'd be interested in your observations on why that was.
I feel like in some respects, this is I'm going to pull this conversation off into a surprising place. It's kind of an existential question I ask myself in the job I do most days, which is I think it's really important to reveal the bad stuff that goes on. And I'm quite a hopeful character writing about this in my book. So I kind of do hope that if I reveal the bad stuff will change. And a kind of slightly I probably do buy into a certain liberal myth of progress on some level, on some deep human level, even though I kind of know it's nonsense, on some deep down way. Maybe I just really want to. But I'm also aware that actually the kind of the stories and the reality of the world makes people jaded, it makes people cynical, and can kind of create this, like, a kind of authoritarian friendly environment, frankly, in which you go, do you know what, they're all lies. It's a very like 1990s onwards Russia model, in which everyone's lying. Everyone knows everyone's lying. No one believes anything, without getting to Adam Curtis on it, but like a kind of sense in which everything's priced in, and no one trusts anything a politician says. So I'm going to I'm not going to get involved with all that, but I get a cultural satisfaction from some element of this politics. Or I get, like, in some ways as well, a material satisfaction. Like the success of Boris Johnson, we ran a really great piece on Open Democracy not long after the general election, which was mapping the vote onto home ownership, and showed that, like, if you go into home ownership was a really, really strong, in terms of like seats with high home ownership were far more likely to vote Conservative, even in nominally what would be seen as working class areas, places like the traditional, like the Workington man thing. I think Workington, out of the 650 seats in Britain, is in the top 100 for home ownership. Shoreditch, actually, where our office is bottom. It's number 650th, and the Conservatives don't poll anything there. And so there's a kind of material interest at times in policies, so we shouldn't ignore that. But if you think everyone's lying to you all the time, you don't trust any of them, then it's a free pass to just vote for your own, like, strategic self-interest in a given moment.
I mean, there's a really interesting moment. I remember watching the closing 6 o'clock news on the BBC of the general election. I think this is where it was, where Laura Kuenssberg summed up the election as being the election of big lies, where Boris Johnson had done all of the things that we've been talking about, and Jeremy Corbyn had claimed that the NHS might be privatised. And she created this equivalence between the two positions. And I thought they were different sort of categories of statement. So changing your Twitter account to be a fact-checking service is obviously dishonest. Making a claim that your opponents want to privatise the NHS didn't seem to me to be a big lie. It seemed to be a claim that might not have been fully evidenced. And yet the broadcast media, which is where I think a lot of people went for balance, portrayed what Labour were doing as being the same as what the Conservatives were doing, which I thought was really interesting.
Yes, I do think there is definitely, and I think it's that, like, it's a difference that we don't normally talk about between, misinformation and disinformation in some respects. Like, misinformation can involve things, I think, that, like, often a degree of nuance, like, of kind of like misinformation. You inadvertently share something that's not false. You make a statement that's not fully evidenced, and in which there's a potential to go, actually, if I fact check this, think about, like, hopefully some of the listeners know the Ferret's fact checking service, because I was involved with setting up the Ferret many years ago. And then we have, like, kind of a half true. There's a kind of half true, which is kind of, look, actually, looking on balance, looking at some misinformation, maybe you could make that call, you couldn't. But we also have a thing called FFS. Which stands for Ferret Fact Service, honestly. And that's for something that's just not true. And that's disinformation. That's a lie knowingly told. And I think there's a kind of, and if you accuse someone of spreading disinformation, you're basically accusing them of lying. And I think, I do take the point. I think there's a kind of sense in which media ability to tell the difference between those two things, really, I think it's, especially not just about that general election in terms of reporting, was we were, it's a point I return to my book a lot about big tech and how basically we've allowed big tech to set the rules of the game rather than states trying to regulate big tech. If you wonder why was there so much analysis of social media during the last general election, there wasn't before, it's because Facebook, in I think it was around 2018, started publishing details of ad spending on Facebook. So, and when the general election happened, there was a huge rush to it. So the entire teams of people were constantly, there was so many stories about Facebook ad spending, which I find really interesting, because almost nobody writes stories about Facebook ad spending now. I'm always telling my journalists, spend an hour going around Facebook. I'm sure there's a story there for you, because, like, but it was in that moment, there was this window we were all just talking about what people were doing on Facebook. And I think that's the thing. So it kind of got it, like, and some journalists, I think, were dealing with mediums they probably weren't as experienced in as others were. I think there's part of it. They were reporting on things that they hadn't probably reported on before. But I also think there's a kind of nuance that's lost in that kind of flattening. You know, as you say, like if you're accusing the Tories of wanting to privatise the NHS, is that the same qualitatively as saying, you know, the rebranding the Tories Twitter account as a fact-checking account? I think most people would go look at that and go, no, it's not the same. You know, because you won't struggle to find at least one Conservative who said over a while that we should privatise the NHS on some level. And you could argue to what extent that's the policy platform of that government, etc., etc. You're then into an argument, and that's fine. It's a useful place to be. But is that the same as saying, you know, something that's purely untrue? No, it's not. And it's the same with Boris Johnson. Like, the Dawn Butler situation was interesting too. Like, so those who don't know, Dawn Butler, MP Brent stood up recently and, you know, kind of accused the Prime Minister of lying, and she cited a few websites, including our own Open Democracy, which was nice, and kind of, you know, sparked an interesting discussion about what do you do? What do you do with someone who lies? And Boris Johnson lies. Donald Trump lies, and that's true. It's not, you know, and some of those lies are misinformation. You know, some of those lies, Boris Johnson is not going out and saying, "Do you know what, I'm going to lie now." You know, he just doesn't. He's not across the detail. And he says stuff that's not true. But there's other times where he clearly is intentionally lying. And we don't really have a political language to deal with that. And I think that's a real problem. And that kind of is an authoritarian's paradise, because you then are back into that space of various versions of reality. It's very, you know, it's a kind of the grim penumbra of the post-1989 world, within which it becomes, you know, basically a contestation of different versions of reality. And we're seeing that play out in front of us right now. Like, you know, I am really interested in that. If I turn TV news I did last night and watch stories about the gas prices, the word Brexit isn't mentioned. It's fascinating. You're like, okay, what's going on here? What's the, you know, and I think there's a kind of, it's kind of sitting in a wider structure where people in my industry are struggling to understand what they can say and what they can't say, and how they should, you know, what does that fabled thing of balance look like in this world in which politicians will tell you things that aren't true. I think it's worth understanding that really is a qualitative difference. Like, I talk to my friends who are reporters who work for whatever you want to call the mainstream media outlets, and they're really grappling with this on a daily basis. They're like, you know, I do my job, I report what the government says, but increasingly I realize the government is lying to me. What do I do? And that's a huge existential problem for information. It's, you know, if you really stare at it for too long, it's like staring at the sun. You slightly go mad, but it's a dangerous thing.
I mean, my liberal myth of progress is that there's a stabilizer on these things, which is that at some point people are going to realize what's happened, and very often it's not the actual thing that this relates to. I mean, I think probably the best example is, but actually both Labour in the UK and the Republicans in the United States took us into the Iraq War on a lie. And people felt they'd been lied to, but we're never going to punish them for that directly. So when the economic crash came in 2008, the mainstream Republicans in the United States got very badly punished for it, not just at that election, but there's that wonderful clip of Jeb Bush, brother of George W. Bush, pleading for applause when he's standing to be the Republican nominee for president in 2016. And because the Bush lies about Iraq had destroyed that part of the Republican Party so much, nobody would applaud him, and that's I think a lot of where Trump comes from. And similarly with Labour in the UK, I think people's anxiety about Labour and the financial crisis is actually a replayed anxiety about what they did in Iraq and the lies that were told about Iraq. And the reason why they're untrustworthy is not because they handled the financial crisis badly, which I think, broadly speaking, within their model, they did pretty well. But it's because people distrusted them over what had happened in 2003. And the blowback has been that Labour can't get elected for love or money. And those people in the Republican Party in the United States who look like George W. Bush don't get selected anymore to run for Rosa. And I think there's been a blowback there. And I wonder if people are going to realise what's happened here, and there'll be a blowback against people, probably not Johnson himself, but against people like Johnson. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. I think there is a fascinating question about that, and I think that's the thing that you keep on seeing. This kind of like, what does electoral gravity look like? You know, what does, you know, because it is fascinating watching, say, the current Conservative Party. Like, so when my book was written, and a lot of the research that went into my book, I ended up going down rabbit holes about the entire world of think tanks, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. Right-wing corporate-funded think tanks who don't declare their donors. So that's basically classic dark money. Huge in America. These think tanks made a huge job of shifting the conversation in America from the 70s onwards. If you want to know why America's been so slow to get on board with climate change, it's because of corporately funded think tanks, funded by people like the Koch brothers, billionaires, oil and gas billionaires. This is classic, and it's classic disinformation, old school. It was really thought out. It was really methodical. And I was really interested in how that happened in Britain, because what happened in Britain was many of these similar groups existed. They were really influential under Thatcher. They kind of got into abeyance for a long time, and Brexit really brought them back to life. So I was really interested in kind of how these groups operated. And they were all very close to the likes of the European Research Group and really into deregulation, kind of Singapore on Thames, they called it, model of Brexit. And what's fascinating now is to look at Britain now, we're a year out of the European Union. There's clearly people on the Conservative right who really want that model. But it's quite clear we're not there at the moment either. There's probably some aspects of it. I'm very interested in what's happening in financial regulation. I think we're probably seeing some aspects of a Singapore and Thames in little bits of sectors. But what's fascinating to see is that you've ended up with this really strange kind of hybrid party, the Conservative Party right now, in which there's large, and I don't think it's just due to the pandemic. It was even evident before that. Kind of large-scale public spending in a kind of not in a quite cronyist sort of way. I covered a lot of those kind of COVID contracts, so I was across a lot of that about how money was funneled into kind of Conservative donors and the like of that. But also, really interestingly, the idea of an economic model and the idea of some sort of coherent vision of, say, what does Johnsonian conservatism look like is kind of whatever you want it to be. It is a real grab bag. And in that respect, I think it is far closer to some of the, I think I don't want to get too alarmist, but I think that Viktor Orban is quite an interesting person to look at when it comes to Britain in terms of that sense of political malleability. Kind of being wherever you want it to be. Orban started off as a liberal who's initially funded by George Soros to go to Oxford, and now is kind of authoritarian whose entire regime is based around the demonisation of George Soros and all the things that go around that. And I think there's something really interesting about political malleability, and I think it also goes hand in hand with that, what we talked about earlier about the kind of electorate's malleability. As the sense in which solid, and especially I think, it can't be divorced. I think what you're talking about is really interesting, the decline of the centre left across Europe. And I think things like Iraq was a thing for the centre left in many European countries. Many European centre left parties did support the Iraq war. And I think the decline of the centre left and the kind of crisis of the centre left is really, really palpable and powerful in all this as well.
I mean, that said, of course, the centre-left look like they're about to win an election in Germany, and probably.
I was just thinking that too. By the time this was out, they might be. But interestingly, in that space, they've operated as a government party for many years, and they seem to be running on a kind of continuity Angela Merkel ticket as much as anything else. So they're kind of they're solidly within that space. It doesn't feel like a kind of insurgent centre left, if that makes sense. It's not like this. I think the Spanish centre left success is quite interesting. The German centre left success doesn't feel quite the same as Pessoa's, say.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose just to come back to the book more directly, I think one of the things that I've been really interested in is, I mean, I've got an interest in African politics, and there's a thing that happens in African politics, particularly after liberation movements get into power, which is where you get a small group of people in power and sharing the resources of the state, and we call it state capture. And it looks to me like that's what's happened with the Conservative Party in the post-Brexit period, given the opportunities of COVID. And there's the later edition of your book has a really excellent description of exactly how that's happened. Do you want to talk a little bit about the way in which that sort of what I think is state capture has happened, and how the dark money flowing into politics relates to that?
Well, I'm going to start by saying, because I'm going to start by saying, Peter, I was saying this before you, so just in case you see me writing this, because I've been writing stuff about this right now, which I haven't published yet, about state capture. Myself and like one of the leading anti-corruption experts in Britain were just having a conversation about this over dinner about 2 nights ago, and we were actually asking the question, is it the time to talk about state capture? And I think it's a really interesting one. I think and we were actually talking about exactly what you're talking about, the state capture inquiry in South Africa that's now ongoing in the wake of Jacob Zuma, and the relationship between Zuma and the Gupta brothers, and which has got an incredible line right back to exactly where I'm in London with Bell Possinger, the now deceased Bell Possinger, which did all the reputation laundering on that front. But I digress. I think it's a really interesting question. I think in some ways, the failure to come up with a language around this, and I think the Labour Party in particular's failure to come up with a language around this, is one of the things that led me to start thinking about state capture. I haven't written about it yet, but it's definitely a phrase that's been kind of bubbling around in my mind too. Because what else do you talk about when you have a VIP lane for COVID contracts where political donors get preferences? What else are we talking about when political donors are able to go and meet the government in secret meetings? What else are we talking about where non-elected people are able to get become members of the House of Lords because they give money to political parties? You can get seats on the boards of government departments. In the wake of the Matt Hancock scandal, I did an investigation, Open Democracy, looking at the number of non-executive directors on government departments that have links to the Conservative Party. We found about 16 at least. These are people who are given salaries and who are basically political appointees. I think the question of state capture is really real there, and is something, I've been toying around with it because I often go, look, am I going too far with this? But I feel like there is definitely a need. I'd love to know your thoughts, Peter. There's a need for a language and a narrative to try and explain what's happening. Because, at times by just focusing on one aspect of it, like here at Open Democracy, we're talking a lot today about the election bill. We're talking about freedom of information. I'm thinking about what's going to happen with the Official Secrets Act, what's happening with the migration bill. But in some ways, like the bifurcation of those things into lots of little bits makes it very hard, I think, for people to feel like there's a coherent whole that they can, try and engage with. And I feel like that's one of the reasons I've been talking about state capture, is that a way in which we can actually try and adequately express and describe what we're seeing.
I had an article on a website called Open Democracy about it. If you want to go and have a read. I think the reason why I raise state capture is I think for exactly the reasons that you're talking about. I think if you say this is corruption, people think, but all politicians are corrupt. And I think part of the reason why it was successful for the Tories in the 2019 election was that they looked like they were honest, corrupt people rather than Labour who were hiding something really nasty. The more they behave badly, the more people think that politics is a dirty business full of dirty people doing dirty things, and you don't want anything to do with it, and you should therefore go and find other places for your interests. You shouldn't think about it. You should try and avoid it as much as possible. I'm a really big cricket fan, and when there was corruption in cricket, I remember this sort of sense of revulsion about it. I didn't want to know about it. I didn't want to hear about it because it was something that I loved. And I think for very many people who don't pay the level of attention that perhaps we do to politics, that's very often the impression they get, that this is just it's dirty from top to bottom, and therefore it doesn't really matter who you elect. They're all going to be corrupt in one way or another. But I think there's a very specific set of practices that we've got around the Tory party and around their activities that are quite different to what you might see elsewhere, with people overclaiming their expenses or doing other things that are wrong, but that aren't funneling billions of pounds worth of money out to their political donors.
I think that's it. I think that's the bit where it moves from this world in which, I think that's where the challenge, I think in Britain, the expenses scandal did leave a long tail as well. Like kind of was it about 10 years ago now, more than 10 years ago?
2009.
2009, wasn't it? I think that really did leave a really long tail, this idea of like politicians are in for themselves, they're in for on the make. And I think it made that like it kind of became difficult to tell the difference between, as you say, like over-claiming for something. I'm saying it's a fine thing to do. But that and like, a kind of a structure. The problem at the moment is the political system in Britain is set up in a way that actually incentivizes this. And because it's not set up in a way that it's not about, like, it's not that a donor then, political donor, like, and I think this is where the challenge where I've been thinking about state capture is. It's not like the political donor doesn't give money in a traditional state capture sense in terms, say, of South Africa, as I understand it. Jacob Zuma makes loads of money and squirrels billions off, out of the country, has, feathers his own nest. What's happening in Britain is a much more like kind of, it's not that it's different. It doesn't mean it's not state capture. So what happens in Britain is, if you're like a Conservative minister, so we saw this, say, with Robert Jenrick, who was the housing minister until recently, and Richard Desmond, a Tory donor. Jenrick overturned a planning decision in Desmond's favour, saving Desmond about £50 million in a housing development in East London. A few months earlier, they'd sat with each other, next to each other, at a Conservative fundraising event, and he showed Desmond showed Jenrick a video of this, and this development, and talked up how great it was, etc. And like Desmond's paid like £12,000 for it to be at that dinner, and you're kind of going, okay, what's going on here? Like, it's not like Jenrick's going to get that £12,000 for himself, but Jenrick knows that like helping donors is a really important thing to be if you're a Tory politician. Like, that's how the parties and that's how you survive and thrive. You get rewarded. If you look at it like what just happened, Oliver Dowden was a culture secretary. He got moved into I think he's now the chairman of the Tory party, and with a job to try and fundraise for next election. You think that's a demotion, but it actually kind of isn't a demotion, because actually that's a really important part of what you're supposed to do. And then on the other side of that, if you do that well, you get politically rewarded. But I think even more importantly, once you get out of politics, you get into that world where you get great big non-executive director jobs doing fuck all for huge sums of money. Sajid Javid, who's now back as a health secretary, almost the minute he'd left government, he was on, I think it was about 150, 175,000 pounds a year from Morgan Stanley for like an hour a week or something. And that's the thing. It's like, it's kind of rigged in a very particular way that, like, if everyone doesn't say anything bad about it, like, it's, and it's captured, and it's capturing almost like, it's venal, but it's a different type of venality, if that makes sense. It's less that you end up with a politician money stuffed down the back of their under their mattress, but what they end up with is the politicians are materially encouraged never to rock the boat and to buy into a system within which this kind of capture takes place, because there's no point in the world in them speaking out against it, because they'll only damage themselves.
And there's this thing about being clubbable, which means you go to private members club and you can be talked around, and I think that's a lot of what's happened. I mean, I was absolutely astonished. I mean, it takes a lot to astonish me, but discovering that Lex Greensill had been a civil servant seemed to be absolutely mind-blowing. And then the Prime Minister who made him a civil servant goes and seeks employment after he ceased being Prime Minister, David Cameron, with this sort of one big payday, was the concept that he was going to get billions out of Greensill, so he never needed to work again.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about the Greensill story, I wrote about the Greensill story for the LRB a few months ago. What's fascinating about, what really struck with me was that, as you say, he was made a civil servant. This is a guy, a financier, who was brought into the middle of government. And a couple of things I thought were really interesting with it. One was the huge push within the civil service to have expertise out from outside of government, and a huge push for civil servants to do that too. So there's a kind of what we call the revolving door between business and government, and that's not just it's huge amounts of money. So you say you're a senior civil servant, you go on work as a partner at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers as was, and then go back into government a few years later to return with these learnings from the private sector. What that means in practice is that we end up with these huge bloated consultancy contracts. We spend a fortune on the big four, big five consultants to do almost everything in government. But at the same time as well, you end up with like the likes, like kind of shysters like Greensill, who are kind of selling snake oil. Like Greensill's whole credit financing thing, it's kind of like, if you look at it really, it's what it's doing is paying your bills up front. And I'm not saying it's a Ponzi scheme, but it's not. You look at it and go, well, is this really this revolutionary product? Because this, why, basically you're looking at what's the problem that Lex Greensill for government. I could see it for the private sector. What's this problem for government that Lex Greensill's able to solve? So I thought that was really interesting. One of the reasons I think Greensill was able to have such leverage was because it was happening, and this is still the case, with an overarching kind of ideological, I mean that in a kind of Gramscian sense of like the kind of ideas, the kind of ideas that are closest to hand, that government should have the private sector in the middle of it, and that's the best way to run government. But the other thing that was fascinating too was the kind of the murky politics of it. Like, you couldn't help but love the fact that David Cameron, the man who said he was lobbying, the quiet word in the ear, the next scandal waiting to happen, is the source of the biggest lobbying scandal probably, in kind of living memory. And one of the reasons it was too is that he thought it was quite unseemly that these people go and do multiple jobs. They have all these contracts. He just wanted like one big payday. The one addendum to that, I would say, and actually since I wrote that LRB piece, which I was kind of thinking there might be at least some reform of our god-awful lobbying laws. But the Boardman inquiry has just reported into lobbying now, and the reforms are so cosmetic. Like there really is. I'm not in any way. The chances of actually anything vaguely meaningful seem not likely to happen at all, to be honest.
And I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me when I was reading, particularly the bits around COVID in the book, was that the current position is pretty much a Wild West for funding of elections. And if you were to say, well, look, elections are a relatively small part of the democratic process, there would maybe be an argument there, but yet the government are pursuing these very, very partisan proposals to make it more difficult to vote. So you have to have ID in order to vote, where you have to, I mean, they've already moved from household to individual registration with the aim of driving down the number of students and young people voting. So they're, in a really partisan way, they're intervening in elections to make it more difficult for citizens to have influence, while at the same time doing absolutely nothing in the elections or indeed the decision-making process to shut out these sorts of vested interests.
I think that's exactly it. That's one, and it's one of the things that's really interesting, and it's one of the challenges every time lobbying reform has ever been mooted. It's the same actually when it comes to political donations, frankly. When it comes to political donations, because in Britain, you can give as much money as you want to political parties. There's no ceiling. Lots of other countries have ceilings. And the reason in some ways that is because every time it comes up, the Conservatives say, well, if we're going to do that, the unions have to count in the same way. And so Labour goes, well, we can't wear that because we have no money. And so there's the attempt to kind of smother what will be like either individual voices or collective voices expressed through collective organizations is then seen as akin to companies. So companies get treated a trade union or a citizens group then becomes treated the same as a company, a for-profit company. And I think it's not hard to see the problems with that. It's really genuine if you ask me, like in terms of how do we participate in a democracy? Mass movement organizations is one way to participate in a democracy. I think most people could see that. Is a corporate organization really a kind of is that their shareholders participating? Like who's participating in democracy when a corporate entities participating in democracy? And I think that is one of the things, and it's the same thing. Like in the past, potential reforms, as you say, of lobbying have been used as an attempt to push down on charities, push down on academics as well, on universities, so to make it actually much harder to speak. And I think that's a real problem, and it's one of the reasons why we see so little actual change, is that the debate gets framed in a certain way, and pretty much lots of the different sides of the debate go, actually, do you know what? We don't want to, both Conservative and the left and the right go, actually, let's not get engaged in this because we could lose out of this. And I think that's a real problem.
And I mean, I think, I can understand why people think that state funding of political parties would be an undesirable thing. There's always a greater priority. And I mean, I think your detailing of the influence of is it Matthew Taylor in the anti AV campaign? Where they had
Matt Elliott, who then went on to run the Leave campaign.
Sorry,
fascinating. Yeah, fascinatingly so. Yes.
Saying where children need a new ventilator in their hospital, not a new voting system, which was obviously a ridiculous trade-off. But there's and I note that there were no more ventilators purchased as a result of the no vote to AV. But I think there's it's an unsympathetic cause were you to make the argument for state funding of political parties, but reading the book, the case that we're losing out so much more as a result of the flows of private capital in is, I think, really clear. But I think that's an argument that's going to burn for some time. I'm aware that we don't have much longer to talk, so I just wanted to ask if there's anything you wanted to say to sort of sum up the conversation and to leave people with a thought to go away with.
I guess the one thing I often say at these things, it's easy to be despondent about this. It's easy to go look at all this like series of bad things happening in our politics, and to look around the world and go, look, these are really, and we look at the world burning at the same time. We ask, how is change possible? Like, do you just completely give up? And I think what's interesting is to see the opportunities where things can be different. Lessons. There's opportunities to learn lessons. I even think about my own country of Ireland. Like, we dealt with some of the most thorny social issues for a Catholic country like Ireland around abortion and gay marriage by actually asking citizens, asking people to set terms of reference, to set questions, to set these citizens' assemblies. There's opportunities to take money out of politics. Even in my own work, it's a small thing, but now political donations are no longer secret in Northern Ireland. Shortly a parliamentary inquiry is going to start into freedom of information on the back of some of the work me and my colleagues have been doing at Open Democracy. There is opportunities for change to happen. And I think that's the one thing that kind of keeps me going, that there is spaces and places. And I think it's a question you were asking earlier, Peter, like, can this go on forever? And I think I'm hopeful that it can't, like this kind of current moment, that there is a law of gravity and there's a reason why it's important to reveal these things. But there's also, I talk about this idea at Open Democracy of journalism plus, that it's not just about revealing something bad that's happening. It's about bringing people together and thinking about how we can change it for the better. What's the work that we can do to make it change? And I think that's really important. So that's my kind of throwaway hope, is that actually some change is possible if we work together.
Well, thank you so much for what I think has been a really informative and interesting conversation. The book, again, is here, Democracy for Sale. Do go and get a copy and read the Open Democracy website, where you can keep up to date with these investigations. And no doubt, Peter, will be inviting you back to talk about your next book at the Portobello Book Festival. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it very much, Peter, and hopefully this time it will be in person. Thanks a million.
Indeed. Thank you.